Chapter 3, Part 2 of From Sail to Steam by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The Naval Academy in its relation to the Navy at large, 1850 to 1860, Part 2. I have said that larking met with more than toleration, with sympathy. The once magic word midshipman seemed to cloak any outburst of frolicking. Otherwise, some exhibitions I witnessed could scarcely have passed unscathed. They were felt to be in character by the older officers, and while obliged to reprehend, I doubt whether some of them would not have more enjoyed taking a share. They knew, too, that we were just as proud as they of the service, and that under all lay an entire readiness to do or to submit to that which we and they alike recognized as duty. Sometimes rioting went rather too far, but for the most part it was harmless. One rather grave incident shortly before my entry derived its humor mainly from the way in which it was treated by the superintendent. One of the outbuildings of the Academy, either because offensive or out of sheer deviltry, was set on fire and destroyed. The perpetrator of this startling practical joke was Alexander F. Crossman, of the '51 date, whom many of us yet living remember well. Small in stature, with something of the chip on the shoulder characteristic often seen in such, he was conspicuous for a certain chivalrous gallantry of thought and mien, the reflection of a native brilliant courage, a trait which in the end caused his death about 1870 by drowning, in the effort to save an imperiled boat's crew. The superintendent, a man of ponderous dimensions, and equally ponderous but rapid speech, though it is due to say also unusually accomplished, both professionally and personally, was greatly outraged and excited at this defiance of discipline. The day following he went out to meet the corps, when it had just left some formation, and calling a halt, delivered a speech on the basis of the Articles of War, a copy of which he brandished before his audience. These ancient ordinances, among many other denunciations of naval crimes and misdemeanors, pronounced the punishment of death, or such other worse as a court martial might adjudge upon any person in the navy who shall maliciously set on fire, or otherwise destroy, any government property not then in the possession of an enemy, pirate, or rebel. The gem of oratory hereupon erected was paraphrased as follows by the culprit himself, aided and abetted in his lyrical flight by his roommate, John S. Barnes, who after graduating left the service, returned for the War of Secession, and subsequently resigned finally. To this survivor of the two collaborators I owe the particulars of the affair. How many more traitors there were I know not. Those who recall the speaker will recognize that the parody must have followed closely the real words of the address. Young gentlemen assembled, it makes no matter where, I only want to speak to you, so hear me where you are. Some vile incendiary last night was prowling round, who set fire to a roundhouse and burned it to the ground. I'll read the naval law. The man who dares to burn a roundhouse, not the enemy's, a traitor's fate shall learn. And if a man there be, who does this traitor know, and keeps it to himself, he shall suffer death also. 'Tis well then to tell then, who did this grievous ill, and damn him I will hang him, so help me God I will. If anything could have aided to the gaiety of the fire, such an outburst would. In after years I sailed under the command of this speechmaker. At monthly musters he reserved to himself the prerogative of reading the articles, probably thinking that he did it more effectively than the first lieutenant, in which he was quite right. It also happened that, owing to doubt whether a certain paragraph applied to the Marine Corps, Congress had been pleased to make a special enactment that the word persons in such and such a clause should be construed to include marines. Coming as this did near the end, some humorist was moved to remark that the first Sunday in the month muster was for the purpose of informing us authoritatively that a marine was a person. As the captain read this interesting announcement, his voice assumed a gradual crescendo, concluding with a profound emphasis on the word marines, which he accompanied with a half turn and a flourish of the book toward that honorable body, drawn up in full uniform, at parade rest, its venerable captain, whose sandy hair was fast streaking with gray, standing at its head, his hands meekly crossed over his sword hilt, the blade hanging down before him, all doubtless suitably impressed with this definition of their status, which for greater certainty they heard every month. It was very fine indeed, appealing to more senses than one. The shore drills, infantry and field artillery, furnished special occasions for organized or disorganized upheavals of animal spirits. For these exercises we then had scant respect. They were soldiering, and from time immemorial soldier had been an adjective to express uselessness, or that which was so easy as to pass no man's ability. A soldier's wind, for example, was a wind fair both ways, to go and to return. No demands on brains there, much less on seamanship. The curious irrelevancy of such applications never strikes persons, unless indeed a perception of incongruity is the soul of wit, a definition which I think I have heard. To depart without the ceremony of saying good-bye takes its name from the most elaborately civil of people, French leave, while the least perturbable of nations has been made to contribute an epithet Dutch to the courage derived from the whiskey bottle. In the latter case, however, I fancy that, besides a tradition of long ago national rivalries, there may have been the idea that to excite a Dutchman you must, as they say, light a fire under him, or as was forcibly remarked by a midshipman of my time of his phlegmatic room-mate, he had to kick him in the morning to get him started for the day. To return to the shore drills, these were then committed to one of the civil professors of the Academy, a fact which itself spoke for the familiarity with them of the sea lieutenants, as these always exercised us at ship's guns. The different estimation which the two obtained in the outside service was too obvious to escape quick-witted young fellows, and it was difficult to overcome the resultant disrespect. The professor was not one to effect the impossible. He was a graduate of West Point, a man of ability, not lacking in dignity, and personally worthy of all respect. But he stuttered badly, and this impediment not only received no mercy from the youth, but interfered with the accuracy of manoeuvres where the word of command needed to be timely in utterance. Report ran that on one occasion, advanced by the column of companies, while the professor was struggling with halt, the leading company, composed martyrs to discipline, marched over the sea wall into 3 feet of water. Had the water been deeper, they might have been less literal. Despite his military training, his bearing and carriage had not the strong soldierly stamp which might redeem his infirmity, and even in the classroom a certain whimsical atmosphere seemed born from the drill ground. He, I believe, was the central figure of one of the most humorous scenes in Herman Melville's White Jacket, a book which, despite its prejudiced tone, has preserved many amusing and interesting inside recollections of a ship of war in the olden time. The naval instructor on board the frigate is using Rodney's battle of 1782 to illustrate on the blackboard the principles of naval tactics to the class of midshipmen. Now, young gentlemen, you see this disabled French ship in the corner, far to windward of her fleet, between it and the enemy. She has lost all 3 masts, and the greater part of the ship's company are killed and wounded. What will you do to save her? To this knotty problem many extemporized practical answers are given, of which the most plausible is by Mr. Dash of Virginia. I should nail my colors to the mast and let her sink under me. As this could scarcely be called saving her, Mr. Dash is rebuked for irrelevance. But after the gamut of possible solutions has been well guessed over, the instructor announces impressively, "That ship, young gentlemen, cannot be saved." I cannot say that he dealt with us thus tantalizingly, but one of my contemporaries used to tell a story of his personal experience which was generically allied to the above. At the conclusion of some faulty maneuver, the instructor remarked aloud, "This all went wrong, owing to Mr. P's not standing fast in his own person. I will now repeat it for the particular benefit of Mr. P." The repetition ensued, and in its course the instructor called out, "Be careful, Mr. P, and stand fast where you are." "I am standing fast," replied P, incautiously. "Report Mr. P for talking in ranks." At the Academy, naval tactics were not within his purview, and of all our experiences with him in the classroom, one ludicrous incident alone remains with me. One of my class, though in most ways well at head, was a little alarmed about his standing in infantry tactics. He therefore, at a critical occasion, attempted to carry the textbook with him to the blackboard. This surreptitious deed, being not to get advantage over a fellow, but to save himself, was condoned by public opinion; but being unused to such deceits, in his agitation he copied his figure upside down, and became hopelessly involved in the demonstration. The professor next day took occasion to comment slightingly on our general performance, but "as to Mr. Blank," he added derisively, "he did wretchedly." I sometimes wonder that we learned anything about soldiering, but we did, in a way. The principles and theory were mastered, if performance was slovenly, and in execution as company officers we got our companies there, although just how we did it might be open to criticism. In our last year, the adjutant of my class, who graduated at its head, on the first occasion of forming the battalion, after some moments of visible embarrassment, could think of no order more appropriate than "Form your companies fore and aft the pavement." Fore and aft is lengthwise of a ship. No humiliation attended such a confession of ignorance on that subject, but had the same man missed stays when in charge of the deck, he would have been sorely mortified. His successor of to day probably never will have a chance to miss stays. There thus ran through our drills an undercurrent of levity, which on provocation would burst out almost spontaneously into absurdity. On one occasion the battalion was drawn up in line, fronting at some distance the 5 buildings which then constituted the midshipmen's quarters. The intimation was given that we were to advance and then charge. Once put in motion, I know not whether stuttering lost the opportunity of stopping us, but the pace became quicker and quicker till the whole body broke into a run, rushed cheering tumultuously through the passages between the houses, and reformed, peaceably enough, on the other side. The captains all got a wigging for failing to keep us in hand, but they were powerless. The whole thing was without preconcertment or warning. It could hardly have happened, however, had the instinct of discipline been as strong in those drills as in others. A more deliberate prank was played with the field artillery. These light pieces, being of the nature of cannon rather than muskets, obtained more deference, being recognized as of the same genus with the great guns which then constituted a ship's broadside. On one occasion they were incautiously left out overnight on the drill ground. Between tattoo and taps, 9:30 to 10 p.m., was always a half hour of release from quarters. There was mischief ready made for idle hands to do. The guns were taken in possession, rushed violently to and fro in mock drill performance, and finally taken to pieces, the parts being scattered promiscuously in all directions. Dawn revealed an appearance of havoc resembling a popular impressionist representation of a battlefield. Here a caisson with its boxes, severed from their belongings, stretched its long pole appealingly toward heaven. The wheels had been dispersed to distant quarters of the ground and lay on their sides. Elsewhere were the guns, sometimes reversed and solitary, at others not wholly dismounted, canted at an angle, with one wheel in place. As there were 6 of them, complete in equipments, the scene was extensive and of most admired confusion. Ingenuity had exhausted itself in variety, to enhance picturesqueness of effect. How the lieutenant in charge accounted for all this happening without his interference, I do not know. Certainly there was noise enough, but then that half hour always was noisy. The superintendent of that time had, when walking, a trick of grasping the lapel of his coat with his right hand, and twitching it when preoccupied. The following day, as he surveyed conditions, it seemed as if the lapel might come away. But he made no speech, nor, as far as I know, was any notice taken of the affair. No real damage had been done, and the man would indeed have been hard-heartedly conscientious who would judge the action which showed in so comical a sight. I once heard an excellent First Lieutenant, Farragut's own through the principal actions of the War of Secession, say that where there was obvious inattention to uniform, there would always be found slackness in discipline. It may be, therefore, that our habits as to uniform were symptomatic of the same easy tolerance which bore with such extravagances as I have mentioned, the like of which, in overt act, was not known to me in my later association with the Academy as an officer. We had a prescribed uniform, certainly, but regulations, like legislative acts, admit of much variety of interpretation and latitude in practice, unless there is behind them a strong public sentiment. In my earlier days there was no public sentiment of the somewhat martinet kind, such as would compel all alike to wear an overcoat because the captain felt cold. In practice there was great laxity in details. I remember in later days and later manners, when we were all compelled to be well buttoned up to the throat, a young officer remarked to me disparagingly of another, "He's the sort of man, you know, who would wear a frock coat unbuttoned." There's nothing like classification. My friend had achieved a feat in natural history. In 10 words he had defined a species. On another occasion the same man remorselessly wiped out of existence another species, consecrated by generations of blue books and naval regulations. "I know nothing of superior officers," he said. "Senior officers, if you choose, but superior, no." Whether the naval regulations have yet recognized this obvious distinction, whether it is no longer superior officers, but only senior officers, who are not to be treated with contempt, etc., I have not inquired. Apart from such amusing criticism of the times past, it is undoubtedly true that attention to minutiae is symptomatic of a much more important underlying spirit, one of exactness and precision running through all the management of a ship and affecting her efficiency. I concede that a thing so trifling as the buttoning of a frock coat may indicate a development and survival of the fittest. But in 1855 60 frock coats had not been disciplined, and in accordance with the tone of the general service we midshipmen were tacitly indulged in a similar freedom. This tolerance may have been in part a reaction from the vexatious and absurd interference of a decade before with such natural rights as the cut of the beard, not a matter of neatness, but of pattern. Even for some time after I graduated, unless I misunderstood my informants, officers in the British Navy were not permitted to wear a full beard, nor a mustache, and we had outbreaks of similar regulative annoyance in our own servants, one of which furnished Melville with a striking chapter. Discussing the matter in my presence once, the captain of a frigate said, "There is one reply to objectors. If they do not wish to conform, they can leave the service." Clearly, however, a middle-aged man cannot throw up his profession thus easily. Another circumstance that may have contributed to indifference to details of dress was the carefulness with which the old-time sea officers had constantly to look after the set and trim of the canvas. Every variation of the wind, every change of course, every considerable maneuver, involved corresponding changes in the disposition of the sails, which must be effected not only correctly, but with a minute exactness, extending to half a hundred seemingly trivial details, upon precision in which depended, and justly, an officer's general reputation for officer-like character. Not only so, but the mere weight of rigging and sails, and the stretching resultant on such strain, caused recurring derangements, which, permitted, became slovenliness. Yards accurately braced, sheets home alike, weather leeches and braces taut, with all the other and sundry indications which a well-trained eye instinctively sought and noted, were less the dandyism than the self-respecting neatness of a well-dressed ship, and were no bad substitute, as tests, for buttoned frock coats. The man without fault in the one might well be pardoned, by others as well as himself, for neglect which had never occurred to him to be such. His attention was centered elsewhere, as a man may think more of his wife's dress than his own. After all, one cannot be always stretched with four pins, as the French say. There must be some give somewhere. The frock was then the working coat of the Navy. There were fuller dress for exceptional occasions, in which, at one festive muster early in the cruise, we all had to appear, to show that we had it, but otherwise it was generally done up in camphor. The jacket, which was prescribed to the midshipmen of the Academy, had informal recognition in the service, and we took our surviving garments of that order with us to sea, to wear them out. But while here and there some officer would sport one, they could scarcely be called popular. One of our lieutenants, indeed, took a somewhat sentimental view of the jacket. "There was Mr. S," he said to me, speaking of a brother midshipman, "on deck yesterday with a jacket. It looked so tidy and becoming. If there had been anything aloft out of the way, I could say to him, 'Mr. S, just jump up there, will you, and see what is the matter.'" War, which soon afterwards followed with its stern preoccupations and incidental deprivations, induced inevitably deterioration in matters of dress. With it the sack coat, or pilot jacket, burrowed its way in, the cut and insignia of these showing many variations. The undergraduates at the Academy in my day had for all uses a double-breasted jacket, but it was worn buttoned or not at choice. On the rolling collar a gold foul anchor, an anchor with a rope cable twined around it, was prescribed. But while a standard embroidered pattern was supplied at the Academy store, those who wished procured for themselves metal anchors, and these not only were of many shapes and sizes, but for symmetrical pinning in place demanded an accuracy of eye and hand which not every one had. The result was variegated and fanciful to a degree, but I doubt if any of the officers thought aught amiss. So the regulation vest buttoned up to the chin, but very many had theirs made with rolling collar to show the shirt. I had a handsome, very dandy Creole classmate, whom an admiring family kept always well supplied with fancy shirts, and I am sure, if precisians of the present day could have seen him starting out on a Saturday afternoon to pay his visits, with everything just so, except in a regulation sense, and not a back hair out of place, they must have accepted the results as a testimony to the value of the personal factor in uniform. Respect for individual tastes was rather a mark of that time in the Navy. Seamen handy with their needle were permitted, if not encouraged, to embroider elaborate patterns in divers colors on the fronts of their shirts, and turned many honest pennies by doing the like for less skillful shipmates. Pride in personal appearance, dandyism, is quite consonant with military feeling, as history has abundantly shown, and it may be that something has been lost as well as gained in the suppression of individual action, now when an inspecting officer may almost be said to carry with him a yardstick and micrometer to detect deviations. A very curious manifestation of this disposition to bedeck the body was the prevalence of tattooing. If not universal, it was very nearly so among seamen of that day. Elaborate designs covering the chest or back or arms were seen everywhere, when the men were stripped on deck for washing. There was no possible inducement to this, except a crude love of ornament, or a mere imitation of prevailing fashion, which is another manifestation of the same propensity. The inconvenience of being branded for life should have been felt by men prone to desertion, but the descriptive lists which accompany every crew were crowded with such remarks as Goddess of Liberty, R.F.A. right forearm, the which, if a man ran away, helped the police of the port to identify him. My memory does not retain the various emblems thus perpetuated in men's skins. They were largely patriotic and extremely conventional, each practised tattooer having doubtless his own particular style. Many midshipmen of my time acquired these embellishments. I wonder if they have not since been sorry. Chapter 4